Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here today and to join this conference. Thank you for the warm welcome. So, as alluded to earlier, I'm going to be discussing the role of inclusive and accessible transport in achieving and unlocking our net zero ambition. So, as mentioned, I'm Rachel. I work at KPMG in the UK. My team focuses on future mobility, but my main focus is sustainable, accessible, and inclusive transport. My main client work is in the UK, but I do also work with other countries around the world and organisations like the World Bank to try and achieve accessible and inclusive transport in other countries too. So for today's session, I'm going to start speaking for around 30 to 40 minutes with some time for questions at the end. I'm going to start by going through the issue as it relates to the environment and this need to ensure that we are ready to make the changes required to meet our emission targets. Then I'm going to talk through some of the issues related to modal shift and accessibility and inclusion, largely focusing on women and people with disabilities, but I'm also going to be looking at other areas that are important to consider, such as being in a rural location or being on a low income. Then I'll talk through how we practically address this issue and the real benefits of doing this. We can then have an open discussion around the issue, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. As a note, my previous research is mainly focused on the UK, and my client work, as I said, also largely focused on the UK, but I have taken a more global approach to this presentation and tried to... I think I've been muted. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
I've taken a more global approach as well as a regional approach in Africa, although the region isn't my main area of expertise, so please do comment and ask questions at the end as well. Firstly, we all know that there is a real and pressing issue in relation to the need to cut emissions in the transport sector. So motorised transport still largely relies on internal combustion engines, and as a sector, transport accounts for more than a third of CO2 emissions from end-use sectors. In order to reach our global net zero emissions, we need to therefore reduce emissions in the sector by around a quarter by 2030. This will take many forms, but it will likely be a combination of new technologies, electric vehicles, and switching to public transport or active travel. So making changes, this is what I mean by modal shift. It basically means making changes in the types of modes we use to travel around. However, many parts of the population are unable or unwilling to make that switch because the alternative green transport solution... You cannot hear it, right? Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes.
The alternative green solutions are either inaccessible, unsafe, expensive, or ill-suited to the needs more generally of the population. So this is a particular dilemma I'm going to focus on the session today. We need to make the shift to net zero, but there are still many parts of the population who can't or are unable to make that switch. Okay, so as I mentioned, we need to change how we design and how we use transport to reach our net zero goals, because the issue isn't going away on its own. So we know that emissions in the transport sector grew at an annual average rate of 1.7% from 1990 to 2002, which is the fastest than any other end-use sector except for industry. We know that to reach net zero by 2050 globally, we need to reduce sector emissions by 3% per year to 2030. And in two...
Oh, sorry, who is that? Please, come on.
In 2022, we know that there was an increase in the emissions in the sector after COVID, but also to note, Africa contributed the lowest share of greenhouse gas emissions, just 3.9% among world regions in 2022, despite being home to 18% of the world population. So we know that as a continent, Africa is contributing one of the lowest shares, despite having almost a fifth of the world's population. We know that transport continues to rely on oil products for nearly 91% of its final energy. And we know that demand for transport fuels grew by almost 50% between 2010 and 2010 in Africa specifically. So based on current trajectories and policies, transport energy use on the continent is anticipated to grow by another 2/3 by 2040. So in terms of inclusive and accessible transport, and linked back to the previous slide, the reason this is an issue is multi-layered, but from my perspective, there are kind of three key imperatives. As I mentioned already, there is a clear environmental imperative to make changes. We need to change what types of transport we use to reduce our carbon footprint, but we also need to focus on inclusive and accessible transport from a financial perspective. So we know that in the UK, for example, companies lose around £42 million a month by not providing inclusive transport services. We also know, for example, that women globally are 21% more likely to use public transport than men, but in the UK alone, over half of women have experienced harassment or sexual assault on public transport. So the fact that we know that women are more likely to actually get on public transport, but they fear for their safety means they're less likely to, is a financial worry, as well as being an ethical worry for transport operators. And then the first point, which I think is probably one of the most important, but often unlikely to make the case for some people, is that everyone should be able to use and access transport equally, spontaneously, and with dignity. In terms of what I mean by that, the concept of spontaneity means you should be able to get up one day and get on your transport service of choice without needing additional help or support or planning significantly in advance, which is often the case. So how different people travel and why this is an issue in the approach to net zero. So we know for gender that transport is not gender neutral. The relationship between gender and transport cuts across different aspects from the sector, from workforce participation, who makes a decision in the sector, and how people travel. Despite the evidence, transport infrastructure and services cater primarily to the needs of commuters who travel from home to work, which means that they ignore the needs of women in other communities, which often widen inequality gaps. So why does this matter? Well, it matters a lot. It means the way that we design transport systems won't account for these differences. And as we've seen globally, that means transport systems are often designed for people who directly go from home to work. So this means people, for example, who'd carry luggage or children or stop off at shops on the way, transport systems don't tend to work for them. It also means that transport systems don't consider critical factors such as safety, traveling with children, and fare types. This sector also suffers from a lack of diversity at the top, meaning people who might have these sorts of experiences on transport aren't represented well when critical decisions around design and infrastructure are being taken. So 8% of transport ministers globally are women, for example, but 20 million women would work in the transport sector if the sector had achieved gender parity in employment. In sub-Saharan Africa, we know that women are more likely to walk, cycle, or use public transport than men. As men are more likely to own their own vehicles. So what does that tell us? It tells us that we need to ensure that those forms of transport that women are more likely to use are affordable, accessible, and suited to the travel patterns of women to further encourage them to use them, but also understand why this gap exists and how we could encourage men to also use active or public transport options. Women are also more likely to use non-regular or non-formal forms of transport in the region. They travel outside peak hours, they make more complex journeys, what we call trip chaining, where you carry children or shopping or you don't go directly from home to work. And what does this tell us and what can we learn from it in terms of designing transport systems to suit their needs? 52% of women in Nairobi reported witnessing sexual harassment while using public transport, with over a quarter personally experienced such harassment. So we know that women feel unsafe using public transport. We also know that women are 3 times more likely than men to be concerned for their safety, so they often choose longer, more costly, and less efficient modes of travel, which has been termed the pink mobility tax. So what can we do about this? Same for disability. We know that disability impacts a significant number of people in Africa in particular. About 10 to 20% of the population across Africa has a disability, and more than half of all disabled people live in urban areas. We know there are issues around using school transportation across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, as they are often less accessible than public transportation. We also know there's a link between disability and poverty, as persons with disabilities are often unable to access services and facilities via transport. Research from across 29 African countries found that people with disabilities are taking between 27 and 65% fewer journeys than their non-disabled counterparts. This impacts everything from access to education, employment, healthcare, and their social lives. It also reduces revenue for transport operators and leads to all sorts of personal problems for those individuals who can't access the things that they need. Similar issues are seen in the UK. Over half of working age disabled people said that they had difficulty in accessing bus services as a barrier to work, meaning we're losing out a significant number of economically productive people simply because they can't access a bus. This could be both from a geographical reason or from a physical reason, for example, physically inaccessible infrastructure or bus services. So just to be clear, there's lots of different types of ways that transport inaccessibility impacts people with disabilities. So this could be step-free access and boarding issues. So literally the ability to get onto a bus or a train because there's not step-free access or level boarding. It could be if you're visually impaired or have a hearing impairment, this could be the way that you receive information. So not having audible announcements, large font, use of Braille. It could be a lack of clear information on ticketing or wayfinding for people with learning difficulties or neurodiversity. It could be that there's no way that you don't have access to digital systems if you're required to buy tickets online. Tactile services, people with visual impairments can be really important. And it could also be around the people that you're surrounded by. So people, fellow passengers not supporting you or harassing you, or staff on those transport systems not being trained to understand how to help you. So there's lots of different ways that transport currently excludes people with different types of disabilities, but clearly there is an issue if we know that between 27 and 65% of people in Africa are doing less, are making those fewer travel basically because of those issues. But it's not just gender and disability that will impact how people travel. So there's all sorts of different types of characteristics that will also have an impact. So the type of minority or vulnerable community depends on the context that you're in. So it could be gender, age, income level, race, sexual and gender minorities, rural, geographic location, disability, including neurodivergence, other health conditions, pregnancy, traveling with children. There's all sorts of different factors that will impact the way that you are able to travel. So for example, low-income households in Africa, urban transport costs account for around 20% of their household budget, which means that affordability is a really key aspect for many households. We know that under half of urban residents have access to public transport, meaning half do not. A third of public transport facilities, mainly in the global north, are not wheelchair accessible, and electric vehicles are still considered very expensive, up to 70% more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles, making them unaffordable for many. And as I said, other factors in different regions will also have an impact. So for example, in the UK, racial minorities are much less likely to cycle. Pregnant women often struggle to find seats on buses and trains. And often people don't want to travel during peak hours, for example, because of crowdedness, difficulty finding their way. Neurodiverse people may struggle to understand networks, maps, and information provided by transport systems. And sometimes, and this is another really important aspect, some people's inability to access transport is temporary. So having a broken leg, for example, or traveling with large suitcases, or traveling with children, even if it's just for a few years using a buggy, means that you'll find transport inaccessible, even if for a short period of time, but that will still act as a barrier to your ability to use different types of transport. So our systems, as I said, don't account for these differences between different people well enough, which means that some people are unable or unwilling to use those systems. And there are many, many types of ways that current transport systems exclude certain parts of the population because they don't account for these differences. So in Africa in particular, barriers in transport in Africa were attributed to a wide range of factors, including how vehicles are designed, transport infrastructure, and the built environment. So that could be, for example, pavements or the way that bus stops are put together or rail stations are built, attitudes of drivers and co-passengers. So not feeling supported by staff or by other people using transport. Similar trends are also seen around the world. So we know that physical barriers to public transport, digital literacy, unsafe bike or pedestrian paths, untrained staff is also an issue found in other countries as well. We also know that safety concerns are a key aspect, particularly around women, children, and other minorities. So for vulnerable parts of the population, solving this can include training staff, improving lighting, improving CCTV access to make it safer for people to travel. Affordability will always be an aspect, sometimes on public transport, but often around electric vehicles. And we know that the way that transport systems are designed generally work for the average traveller. So the person travelling from work to home with a standard commute pattern, and doesn't account for different patterns around travelling with children, stopping off on different places, or travelling with luggage and other things that may create barriers. There are also aspects of policy legislation and standards that will impact how decisions how transport is designed, but also who's making those decisions around how transport should be standardized and regulated. So we know, for example, that without representation of women and people with disabilities, that those standards and regulations are less likely to include the specific ways to make transport safer and more accessible for different types of people. But importantly to remember, all UN countries have signed up to Sustainable Development Goals, which include a specific target 11.2 to provide safe, affordable, accessible and sustainable transport systems for all, which means every country has already committed to try and rectifying this issue. Particularly in Africa, research found that many countries in the region do not include or superficially include people with disabilities in their transport policy frameworks. Ghana is considered to have the most inclusive People with Disabilities Act, while South Africa is considered the most inclusive regarding planning and design of transport facilities and services in the region. Another piece of research in 2021 found that many African countries don't involve people with disabilities in planning and designing transport infrastructure and services. And we know that there's an issue around informal transport systems or within private taxis. We found that there's been research that found that shared minibuses, in shared minibus taxis, having support from other passengers was a key aspect of whether or not people felt safe. Venture capitalists have invested more than $70 billion globally in mobility innovations, but very few of those investment committees included women. So specific innovations around improving transport safety and accessibility for women may have been overlooked. So after everything I've said, and there's some real case studies, and there's quite a few different case studies from around the world that show how actually making these changes can lead to some really important benefits. So from Paris in 2018, it was noted that only 36% of Velib subscribers, which is the city's bike sharing scheme, were women, which is obviously less than what we'd expect at 50%. Many women said that safety was a key barrier for them using the system. And the mayor, Anne Hidalgo, noted this in her Plan Velo, which is her plan for bikes across the city. And she wanted to look specifically at gender equality and work out why women were using bikes less than men. So they specifically looked at those reasons and then acted on those reasons. So women were concerned about safety, so having protected bike lanes with lighting at night to help women feel safer. There was also an issue around bag theft on bikes. And also an issue around connectivity and accessibility of where the bikes were around the city. So they looked at these issues in particular, tried to invest in those particular areas. So they built lots of new bike lanes that were protected over 1,000 kilometers, installed better lighting. And by 2020, they'd seen a 6% increase in cycling among women. And they went up to 42% of subscribers. So there was an initiative anyway to try and improve the way that bike paths and cycling was carried out across the city, but with a particular focus on the issues that affected women, managing to increase women ridership as a result. A similar study in Gothenburg in Sweden looked at how to improve transport accessibility for people with disabilities. So the objective of one of the local councils was to try and reduce the use of costly special transport services. So basically, one of the local authorities were using special transport services for people with disabilities because the public transport wasn't considered accessible, particularly for people who use wheelchairs. However, one trip using this special transport service was 14 times more expensive for the city than public transport. So they tried to look at how they could try and reduce the use of these transport services by actually investing in accessibility at public transport. So they carried out an audit of the public transport systems, found 6,500 easily remedied obstacles that were identified and then removed. So this could be, for example, bollards in the middle of pavements blocking people in wheelchairs access. It could be that bus stops were inaccessible, or other ways that people were struggling to actually use the public transport system. All the buses in the city and more than 60% of the trams were fitted with ramps, and they are now low floor. Most vehicles now have automated voice announcement and internal displays. And as a result, while 40% of tram stops were accessible in 2005, now 90% of them were in 2010. This included street lighting, wider platform areas, and contrasting colours on sidewalks for visually impaired people to be able to see them. Now, as a result as well, 92% of passenger disabilities were happy with how they were treated by the drivers and how the drivers actually drove. They collect regular feedback for transport employees, and saw a 5% increase in survey satisfaction. As a result, they saved 3.8 million euros in 5 years by enabling people to switch from these private transport systems to public transport. So what do we need to do to fully address these issues? This is kind of the response that policymakers, transport officials, and other government and researchers and NGOs can look at trying to do to make a difference in this area. And essentially, there's kind of 6 key aspects here. The first is about data. Data is really the key to all of this. So it remains essential right until the end stages, and it's about understanding the problem that understanding the problem and then designing specifically using that understanding of the problem and continuously monitoring the data to track the changes. This model that I'm about to show you doesn't just apply to transport, but it's often used in more inclusive policy and budget making practices. So firstly, we have to find the data. We know that it exists. I just shared a tiny fraction of it today, and it exists in most countries for a variety of different groups spanning different sectors. It may sit with academics, government departments, including statistical offices, local NGOs or CSOs, but much of it likely exists somewhere. We know broadly that data on disability, gender, etc. does exist, but sometimes we'll need to collect more of it or collect more disaggregated data on different lines. So this could be large-scale research projects to gather insights, to understand who is using transport, who isn't, why not, and what would help change that. Once we have that primary and secondary data, we need to break it apart and then perhaps find even more data. If we find, for example, that there are gender inequalities or gaps related to personal disabilities, we need to unpack it and understand it further. If we don't understand why the data is the way it is, we need to ask more questions. If men use public transport less than women, why? What factors go into that? What would make them use it more, for example? All of this involves finding and engaging with the right stakeholders. A diverse set of stakeholders is key. This has to include everyone and focus significantly on those who are struggling the most with equality in the transport sector. And then we need to actually bring those groups into decision-making. No decision around transport accessibility should happen without decisions being made by disabled people, because they know best about what solutions will help. If women and other groups aren't represented, then the issues that impact them will likely fail to be resolved. Then finally, we have to monitor and evaluate. We have to continuously track the initial trends identified and test what solutions have had an impact and what hasn't. This may be possible in 6 months, or it may take 10 years, but all the interventions need to be effective. And if they aren't effective, what do we do to change them? This is a cycle. So we keep changing our approach, our designs, our policies until we get it right, which is why I put it into a cycle here. So we start as a normal budget and policy cycle with these key kind of 4 aspects. We have to define the objectives, design the policies, implement the policy, and evaluate the policy. And it's no different for this particular issue here. So as I said, we start by defining the objectives using quantitative and qualitative sex-segregated data, or data on disability, on age, on income level, on race, etc. This might require finding or generating new data, conducting audits, surveys, research, trying to understand what the key trends are between different groups across different sectors in transport. We then need to identify what data might be missing for future collections. We then have to look at that data and design the policies and budgets with the above objectives in mind. So using the above findings, how do we need to design our policies to address them? We need to think about who's designing these, and if they're trained to look at the disaggregated data as part of standard practice. And then we need to standardize this approach so it's consistent. So for example, if we found that men are using public transport less than women, and we want to understand why, we need to further understand the issues that men face, or why they might, for example, by not using them. And then when we're designing the policy to try and get men to use public transport more, we need to think about that data and what it's telling us in order to design the policies in that way that might help. We then need to make sure the tools of implementation are supporting the policies, laws, and budget in achieving their intended outcome. So this requires training and capacity building across all the relevant officials and stakeholders to make sure they understand how we're trying to track these specific pieces of data. We need to be able to track the indicators throughout the project, the policy approach. So are we seeing differences in gender as the policy is rolled out? We also need to make sure the teams that are responsible for doing this are representative of the wider population. we then need to evaluate and audit those policies and budgets to make sure they've met their intended objectives. So this could be through a national audit office or through internal processes within ministries or department. This is a really important and useful way of thinking about how we design policies and objectives. It's quite a standard approach to policies and objectives, but it's really important that these kind of 4 steps are considered with that data, the disaggregated data throughout. In the middle of that circle, there's some key prerequisites. So this is in order to make sure this approach works, and this approach often is used in a process called gender responsive budgeting, which is a way of improving gender equality through budget and policy making. This is a similar approach that we'd use for those types of projects. There are kind of a few key prerequisites to making sure this is effective. There has to be political commitment across the political spectrum to make this happen. There has to be an all-of-government approach with institutional capacity to actually see this through. And there has to be systematic collection of sex-segregated or disability-disaggregated data throughout, which means that we need to be continuously and regularly collecting that data to make sure it's feeding through and we're seeing where the results are coming through. And then just before I wrap up, I just wanted to talk through a really important part of this, which is the just transition. So the term just transition was initially developed in America around the 1980s by US trade unions who were essentially looking to protect workers affected by new water and air pollution regulation. It's now used in reference to meeting climate goals by ensuring the whole of society, so all communities, workers, and all groups are brought along in the net transition, building on this concept of leaving no one behind. So a just transition is ensuring that the substantial benefits of a green economic transition are shared widely. So countries, regions, industries, communities, workers, or consumers. Particularly in the global south, the most popular and cheapest forms of transport usually rely on informal labour, so through the informal transport systems, which creates a need to ensure that workers' livelihoods are not threatened due to net zero changes, and where changes are required, support is available. So within the transport sector, this will be looking at things like job losses, job opportunities, reskilling, affordability of green transport, accessibility of new transport, the implications for reduced internal combustion engine vehicles in rural areas, and the impacts on transport workers for climate disasters. So as an example, Nairobi is moving ahead with rolling out electric vehicles and the charging infrastructure that's needed to support that. But as a result, unions in the city have been facing the challenge of wanting to support initiatives, sustainable initiatives, with introducing technologies like e-buses and cashless payment systems in a place that's really characterized by the use of informal transport. So the union has therefore been engaging on this issue and trying to roll out workshops to improve understanding of what a just transition would look like for their workers, pressuring local and national governments to engage with workers during planning and implementation, and engaging employers in each subsector, including the informal sector, over the electrification taking place. So there's a quote there from the Nairobi Union that I've just mentioned, but the point here is that the approach to net zero, to achieve all the things that I've just talked through around accessible and inclusive transport, won't work effectively, particularly in areas where we've got informal transport systems, unless everyone is taken through that process too and supported throughout. So that includes things like reskilling as a key aspect of that, to make sure that we don't just see job losses and a loss for some people or gains for others. So finally, a bit about what we do in terms of how you can do this in the UK and globally, including in Africa. Part of a key aspect of this is around decarbonisation strategies that include accessibility and inclusion throughout, embedding it really throughout the entire decarbonisation strategy. So for example, when we've worked in Tunisia, we looked at rolling out electric buses, and part of that was thinking about how do we make sure the rollout of electric buses will achieve accessible and inclusive goals alongside all the other aspects of what is required to roll out electric buses in terms of charging infrastructure, training of staff, actually procuring the buses, building up a domestic market, thinking about how that will impact a just transition approach. In addition, you can conduct equality audits or impact assessments using tools or processes like gender response budgeting or that policy and budget cycle that I talked through, to try and understand the impact on different groups that a process or a strategy might have on different groups. You could look specifically at those groups around gender, disability, race, etc., to try and understand if we do this particular objective. So let's say, for example, we wanted to build a new bus service in a city, what will the impact be on different groups, and how could we mitigate the negative impacts and maximize the positive ones for different groups? So for example, in a project in the UK, when a UK local authority was looking to roll out a bus service and they wanted to understand what will be the impact on different groups. We use a process called an equality impact assessment, which is a legal requirement for major government programs, to essentially understand, okay, what will this bus do for the 9 groups of people who have protected characteristics? This includes age, disability, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender, and a few others. So you try and go through each of those groups with data and understand, okay, what will this bus do for people with disabilities? Will it improve their lives or negatively impact it? And what can we do about it? We can also conduct analysis to understand the potential market size for inclusive solutions. So this is looking at the cost benefit analysis, for example, of trying to make buses more, or trains or e-scooters more accessible. What will be the benefit and what will be the cost to do so? And key to this is also making sure we bring stakeholders together to foster a sense of co-creation and ensure that people's voices who are often not heard are front and center of decision making. So I'm going to stop there because I know I've covered a lot of ground, and stop sharing. And I will stop for any questions that you might have.